Ask a small business owner today about the biggest obstacles he faces, and you might hear him talk about government rules and regulations. But that hasn't always been the case for those running small businesses. Our next guest says in the past, not even the really distant past, many small business owners saw government as an ally. Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse is Associate Professor of History at UNC-Chapel Hill. He is author of The Land of Enterprise, A Business History of the United States, and Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
So you recently spoke to the John Locke Foundation Shaftesbury Society about small business and American politics in the 20th century, and you titled the lecture, The Populist Paradox. Why so?
Well, the talk I gave springs from a research project I'm doing about the history of small business and particularly its role in American politics, culture, and life in the 20th century, and particularly in the late 20th century. And the paradox that I am sort of pointing to is that in today's political environment, really the political environment that we've seen for the last several decades, the general position of small business owners, as you said, has been sort of an anti-government, anti-regulatory, anti-tax position. Whether or not that applies to every small business is certainly something we could debate, but certainly the loudest voices and mouthpieces of the small business community have aligned themselves with that set of politics. And it's frequently couched in somewhat populist language of the little guy versus the big guy. Now, classically across American history, that dynamic, that small versus big, has often operated within the business community or within the sort of the capitalist structure as an opposition toward entrenched economic power or the size of large companies. And so the talk I gave really kind of looked back at the origins of small business identity and focused on the fact that in the early days of sort of small business identity, that is to say in the early days of when there was big business, small businesses saw themselves primarily in competition with large corporate interests, large monopolies, and so forth, and they turned to the government through tax policy, through antitrust policy, and other types of government policies to redress the kind of imbalances or the competitive challenges they faced. And in fact, when they saw themselves politically, they typically aligned against big business and saw themselves allied with the government. And the paradox I identify is what happens by the late 20th century when that seems to go away. We retain the populist language, that sort of sense of the little versus the big, but the big has now shifted from being big business to being big government.
That is Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse, Associate Professor of History at UNC-Chapel Hill. So those who see government and small businesses as natural antagonists ought to look back at the history a little bit and see that this hasn't always been the case.
Well, particularly, yeah, I think that's right. And when the question comes to, how do you maintain a small economic enterprise in an environment of free competition? And the irony or the challenge is that the conditions of free competition frequently allow those who outcompete to grow, to expand, and to then use the power they create to continue to grow and expand. And so, in fact, this sort of free competition creates the environment in which it can extinguish itself. And if the concern is to kind of perpetuate the small, the local, and the sort of more personal things that we associate with small business, in the past, particularly in the early part of the 20th century and really through the 1930s or so, the focus was on using the law, on using the power of the state to restrict size, restrict mergers and acquisitions and integration at the largest levels, and to actively promote those small businesses.
Do you have a sense at this point in your research about why there's been such a major change?
Well, I think on a political level, the economic crisis years of the sort of last third of the 20th century are key. As of the 1970s, the rapid growth, economic growth that we experienced in the post-World War II years came to a halt. This is the period of inflation, economic stagnation, energy crisis, and so forth, where the sort of expectations of rising tides lifting all boats seemed to come up short. And this coincides with a particular movement really spearheaded by elite and successful economic interests, big businesses, to sort of limit or to try to push back against anything that was perceived to be limiting their economic growth. So the general business response to the end of the growth economy was to redirect their policy attention against regulation, labor unions, and tax policy and things like that. That, on a certain level, attracted many small business owners. And as I said, it's particularly the people who speak on behalf of the small business community as opposed to everyone who owns a small business. But a lot of the organizing around small business that blossoms in the 1970s and 1980s, organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which sort of always seemed to be on the side of Main Street, but they had really in the mid-20th century been a big business-oriented group. They start to turn their focus. The National Federation of Independent Business was created in the 1940s as a fairly localized, survey-oriented group. They become extremely active in political lobbying by the 1980s. And they all sort of coalesce around a common economically conservative view of policy that dovetails very well with the interests of the larger firms as well.
Does any of the change from your vantage point have to do with the way government has changed?
I think that's a part of it. As I said, the big debate among historians of the 20th century is really what the prime movers are. One way to tell the story is that the state itself grew in its reach, in its focus, in the types of positions it was trying to promote, from the Progressive period through the New Deal period and then through the 1960s. And that much of what we've seen since then has been a sort of a pushback against those types of economic policies. I think a complementary way to kind of conceive of the 20th century does really have to do with the challenges of economic growth since the early 1970s and the broad sort of stagnation or slowdown in productivity increases and so forth. And so as a result, whichever one of those stories we want to kind of adhere to, you do have a different role for the government, particularly the federal government, in economic life.
In the remaining time that we have, this is all interesting historically. I think some people listening to us will say, so what does this mean for the future? What's going to be the attitude of business, especially small business, toward government in the future?
Well, I think this is the open question. It is still the case, and in fact, I think it's been consistently the case for the last 30 years that large economic institutions, large corporations continue to grow. They continue to exercise greater competitive advantage over small outfits, and we see this in a variety of spaces, from retail and book selling to tech to certainly the old classical kind of titans of the old industrial economy, from automotive to resource extraction, petroleum, oil, and things like that. It doesn't seem to me that there's much chance of a turnaround. It seems that that's sort of the direction that things are going. The small local mom and pop type stores are under a lot of pressure, and they're under a lot of strain. The policies that could conceivably help them are they don't seem to be the ones that people are really interested in. We're not interested in paying higher consumer prices for a product that gets purchased at a local store if we can get it from a big box store.